Pro-choice does not mean pro-abortion. Pro-choice means you have a choice. If you would like to terminate a pregnancy, you can. And if you would like to carry a pregnancy, you can. Nobody can force you to carry a pregnancy, and no one can force you to terminate a pregnancy. That's what pro-choice means.
Our guest today is Jane George. She's a candidate for Tennessee State Senate, District 6.
Wait, what in the hell does a state senator even do for me?
The State Senate is the upper chamber of the Tennessee General Assembly. Alongside the State House of Representatives, it forms the legislative branch of the Tennessee government and works alongside the governor to create laws and establish a state budget. Responsibilities of the Senate include passing bills on public policy matters, setting levels for state spending, raising and lowering taxes, and voting to uphold or override gubernatorial vetoes. The membership of the Senate elects a presiding officer, known as the Speaker. The Speaker appoints the officers and committees of the Senate and also serves as the state's lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor stands in immediate succession to the governorship if necessary. The state is divided into 33 senatorial districts, from each of which one senator is elected. Senators are elected to 4-year terms, and there is no limit on the number of terms a legislator may serve. To qualify for election to the Senate, one must be 30 years old, a U.S. citizen, a state resident for 3 years, and a resident of the district in which he or she is elected for 1 year immediately preceding the election. The current makeup of the Senate is 28 Republicans and 5 Democrats. 16 seats are up for election this year.
Our guest today is Jane George. She's a candidate for Tennessee State Senate, District 6. Jane, your opponent has portrayed herself as a moderate Republican, yet we often find that her votes don't quite match up with that image. We just learned, for example, that she voted in favor of making protesting a felony, which means that if convicted, protesters will be stripped of their voting rights. Between that and the state's opposition to mail-in voting for people who are worried about COVID-19, it seems like voting rights are really under attack right now in Tennessee. What's your reaction to this, and how might you try to address that if elected?
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree that that's true, that the incumbent and our opponent is in no way a moderate, and she's been proving that with her votes over and over again, her action, and even people that she allows to come into her office to speak to her. And we just had an emergency session, and Tennessee is definitely in a state of emergency. We've entered a recession. Our schools are closing after reopening. When we're looking across the state, we've still got an increase in the number of deaths. We're still in a pandemic. We've got people who are still haven't received unemployment, and the unemployment offerings that are available at the moment are, not very good. We're looking at people taking home less than $200 a week. Obviously, we did have an executive order yesterday, but that's not really in par with anything that's real at the moment. So we're in a situation where voting rights are under attack, and that's just one more in the slew of issues that puts us in an emergency situation. Clearly, if you are convicted of a felony, then you do not have the right to vote, and you lose a number of rights. For example, it's much harder to find a job because you have that on your record. It's much harder for you to get an apartment. If you have child support that you were not able to make while you were in prison, then you're in a situation where you may not even have access to your kids. So this is a very serious law. And we're talking about taking away First Amendment rights after 10 p.m. What is that? The convenience of 10 o'clock, right? So you don't lose your rights at 10 o'clock. And we already have laws in place that cover issues such as vandalism. And so if those are things that they want to prosecute, we've got laws in place for that. Now, let me just tell you something. You know how much this law is going to cost taxpayers per year? $1.3 million. That's what it's going to cost us to enforce this law and to keep those people, pushing them through the system and then keeping them in the system, having been charged with a felony. So it's absurd. It's completely outlandish, and it's one of the other ways that the incumbent has shown her penchant for lining up in line with what I would consider to be fairly extreme right-wing views.
Well, you were born here and raised here. You have really deep roots in Knoxville and East Tennessee. How have you leveraged that to try to garner support from conservatives here? And how do you make words like progressive and Democrat words that don't carry a stigma in East Tennessee?
So I think the main thing that we're focusing on here is let's get off the partisan merry-go-round. Here's the bottom line. We're on the same team, right? We might have two different playbooks, but we're on the same team. So we need to be able to access and talk about those playbooks and find a common ground. Our founding fathers established the democracy based on the fact that we would have to compromise in order to come together to find resolutions, to create laws, and to ensure that we were representing the people and had the people in mind as we did that. So that is a real big part of this campaign. We want to build and strengthen that middle class. And it does not matter if you're Republican or you're a Democrat. This is a critical part of what we need to do in order to save our democracy. And I am not exaggerating when I say that. If we lose our middle class, we're going to implode. Our middle class is absolutely critical for a capitalist society, which we are, and I'm comfortable with that. We need people to support and consume the goods that are produced by, we've got about 20% of our population are what they call makers. And if you look at economics around the world, you'll see that in places like India, 90% of the people are makers. In other words, how it translates to our modern culture is that we have specialization in the United States. Somebody will come and build a house for us. In India, you might be building your own house. That means that a lot of labor goes into sustaining your ability to live and be successful within the culture. We're only 20% of our culture is actually supported and propped up through the makers. And the other 80%, that's those of us who are out there consuming, specializing, and being able, and it's one of the things that makes America incredibly successful, by the way, is that people can specialize. And so we consequently have access to those individuals, right? So when we talk about things in those terms, and people understand that regardless of what their background is or regardless of what their partisan leanings might be, people understand that in order for us to be successful, we got to keep that 80% of people who are who are themselves specialists and who are depending on those specialists in order to survive. The people that make the cars, the people that stock the grocery shelves, the people that raise the food, the people that build the houses, people take care of the roads, the people that teach the kids, right? So that's what we're looking at. And I think we can all come to understand the value of that. It has nothing to do with party. I think that that's a critical component of what we're looking at. And in talking to some of my conservative friends, that they can disagree or can agree with. I think another thing that a lot of conservatives are behind, and the polls are showing this as we go out and do some data gathering, is that the majority of Tennesseans are in favor of a women's right to choose. So when you sit down and talk to people, you will find most of the time in casual conversation that that is something that they are behind, where our incumbent has voted again and again in that midnight bill for the fetal abortion ban, that at 12:34 in the morning on a Friday night behind closed doors, cloaked in the chambers, they made a decision that the majority of Tennesseans would not even support. And that's why they did it the way that they did it. It's completely absurd. So most Tennesseans are behind that, whether conservative politically or more liberal politically. Most Tennesseans are actually behind some sort of policy that helps us to be safe when we talk about things like gun control. Most people want to have background checks. They don't have a problem with waiting. They have most Tennesseans are actually okay with getting rid of the high volume magazines, right? So we're looking at things that we're finding there's a lot of things we have in common. And if we can find that common ground, just like our forefathers said we need to do, we're going to be successful at bringing some of those moderate Republicans into our tent. And that's exciting.
Supporting a sustainable living wage is very important. But how do you balance wage increase ideas such that people within the community are making a respectable income for what they do, but small business owners like my wife, for example, or Lisa in China, who are both small business owners as well, for example, don't worry that costs get passed on to their customers, people going to restaurants, concert goers, et cetera, and potentially hinder businesses instead of helping everyone as a whole rise up.
Okay, here it's a really interesting counterpoint that you put to me, because I think there's a little bit, let's not call it mythology, but I think it's a perspective that we want to kind of move beyond. And that is that business owners do not benefit from having a more sustainable living wage increase. Let me tell you what, if you're a business owner and you have, whether it's service or it's a concert ticket or an office like mine where you have people coming in to get treated, we all do better when people have that kind of money to spend to be able to come in and take advantages of what we have to offer. So when we raise that level of a living wage so that people are able to live a lifestyle that involves having luxury of just simply going to a restaurant and or being able to go see a show or being able to take a vacation or be able to buy something nice for themselves, those are things that I consider, or pay for a home, buy a car, some of the basics. Those are things that I consider to be not a trade-off. I consider that to be a benefit. So I think it's a different way to look at it than the way that you postulated the question. But I think it is important for us to realize if we are paying people a living wage and they have dignity and value in what they are doing, then they are going to be more readily likely to spend that money back in our economy. So I'm not too worried that if I had to increase the wage of someone that was working for me, that they're not going to go out and use that money to do something nice for themselves.
If I can just ask a sub question to that, then do you think that it's more palatable for people? I think we all here would say absolutely there should be a sustainable living wage. Nobody's going to disagree with you here. But for people that kind of like what you're talking about, there maybe is this mythology, oh my gosh, everything's going to crash if you do you think it's more palatable if it's something where there's a transition to it, so you are stepping up to that point and it's not poof one day the minimum wage triples or something like that? You think it's more palatable if it's something that we go, okay, we're going to step into this somewhat expeditiously, but such that it doesn't shock people as much?
You've nailed it, David. And the places that are doing this, the states that have been right there with us, who are still using the minimum wage that was established by the federal government in 2009, the states that are doing that in a stepwise fashion. So that's going to be the only way that you can do it. I mean, otherwise we would end up in a situation like you were alluding to earlier, which is if you put this huge burden on business owners, then there's going to be an impact that is going to be unsurmountable, potentially, for maintaining their ability to stay in and keep their business doors open. So we have to do it in a way that is going to, a stepwise fashion. And I think that we can set goals as to where we want it to come, and then we can have formula that allow us to be predictable in terms of what we would consider to be a raise, let's say, if you want to use that word. That's one that people can wrap their head around every year so that it remains sustainable, of course, not going down. But yes, absolutely. You're completely 100% on.
You've stated that 10% of Tennesseans are without health care. Do you have any idea how that might break down along party lines? And then regardless of political affiliation, do you think that this is a bridge issue that can get voters to come across the aisle to vote for you?
I hope so. I mean, I want to believe that people care. Listen, here's the thing about that. We not only do we have the over 600,000 people who didn't have access to health care, which are working Tennesseans for the most part, by and large, when we went into this pandemic, but we also have a situation where 170,000 people more have lost their jobs, and the insurance that comes along with that job as a benefit. I am very much in favor of accepting Medicaid expansion. Now, you asked the question about party, and I will tell you, so I cannot quote you any data on that. What I can tell you is that it absolutely disproportionately affects people of color. And so that we know. And obviously, and people clearly of lower income, and you are more likely if you are in either of those categories, to be at risk. We've seen it through COVID-19. We see it all the time in terms of our death rates. We see it in terms of our birth mortality issues. We see it in terms of morbidity. We see it across the board that people who are in lower economic, who tend to be more likely Democrat, are absolutely affected by these decisions more than the wealthy, who tend to be Republicans. I don't want to make any huge generalizations, because we're just talking about how things trend out, right? So the idea is that if you can convince, which I think we have the information to do this, I know we do, is that it is a fiscally smart responsibility for us to accept Medicaid expansion. Now, I'm not making that up, and that's not even based on any weird models, you know, out of the Freeman Institute at University of Chicago. This is actually real stuff. When you look at Arkansas and you see what they didn't take it until 2017. We see their before and after. And we saw that they were able to pay not just for their first year, but their second and third year in savings to the state, just in the first year when they accepted Medicaid expansion. Oklahoma's done it, Louisiana's done it. You know, we're going that round where people are saying, wait a minute, we need the money. You know, we're going to stop standing on this partisan soapbox, and we're going to take this money and help the people of our state. So far, you know, we just had an emergency session as we started this conversation with, and that was not even on the table as something that's an emergency. Tennessee is #1 in the nation in the amount of rural hospitals that have been lost over the last 8 years. We've closed 2 in the last 3 weeks. I just got a phone call from a friend of mine, and this is not a secondhand account story, and I'm not making this up. Was a real conversation. She's a CPA. She got a phone call 2 days ago from one of her clients saying, can you tell us how much is on my husband's W-2? Because he thinks he's having a heart attack right now, and he's trying to get health insurance so we can go to the hospital. These are people that through COVID lost their business, they lost their home, they're already compromised, and now here he thinks he's having a heart attack, and his wife is calling their CPA to find out what his W-2 is so they can see if they can qualify for some help before they go to the hospital. Then they get to the hospital, and they live in a more rural part of Tennessee. They get to it's a small regional hospital. When they get there, it's full. So what happens? They have to admit this guy in the emergency room. They have to bring a hospital bed into the emergency room. They have to treat him in an emergency room where people are coming in screaming and crying. People are coming in that are carrying COVID, amongst a lot of other things. We have to remember COVID is not the only health challenge Tennessee has. And this is the whole not in my backyard thing, where a lot of people in these cities in Tennessee who think we're fine, and they want to compartmentalize themselves. Oh, we're different than those people. Oh, we have more rights than those people. Oh, we have more money than those people. Well, guess what? You're human and they're human, and you're all Tennesseans. We need to take care of everybody. And if you go to church, you've learned that lesson. And it's time for you to show up doing it, right?
So another emergency we have in the state of Tennessee is hungry kids. And yes. I think according to your platform, over 20% of children in the state are going hungry, and I'm sure that's increased due to COVID as well.
Absolutely.
How do you propose we address that as a state?
Well, I think one of the big problems we have in this state are called food deserts, right? And one of the reasons we have food deserts is because 80% of our agriculture is raising livestock. We don't even grow healthy food in Tennessee. We have to get it imported. And in addition to that, the 20% of crops that we're growing are mostly soybean and corn to feed the livestock. So we need to start to shift and think about how we want to look at our agrarian communities and try to find ways that we can be supportive of farmers who would want to take on the idea of converting a livestock farm into perhaps something that would be producing live food. That's one idea. It's a little abstract, to be honest with you. We don't have any tangible things that we can do. Maybe farmers will be willing, and maybe they won't. But that's one thing that I'm looking at, is how do we get fresh food into these food deserts? We grow it locally. We also have in Tennessee, and I can talk certainly about our district, we have a lot of small farmers. And if we can connect those small farmers, which is happening organically, it's a beautiful thing about where we live. We have these amazing people who are growing food, and they're trying to get that food out to help these communities that are underserved. And that's an incredible thing. We need to see more of that, especially right now and during this time. But those people need to also make a living for what they've done, in raising healthy food locally. So that's one thing. We also want to make sure that if schools shut down, as we saw in March, that kids still have access to the support that they got in the schools for food and nutrition. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, one of the things that's been going on with schools over the last 3 years, and I know this because I have friends from on the West Coast, the great friends of mine that I've known for many years, and it's a community of teachers. And one of the things that when they started to strike 2 years ago in Chicago and in Los Angeles, what was happening is that a lot of funds were being filtered off of things like nurses and counselors into the food program. But it wasn't because they were getting healthy food for the kids. It was because they were going back to the old standards where they were all meeting in Las Vegas. Instead of a nutritionist coming into the convention and saying, this is what we need, you've got managers, literally cafeteria managers coming in and saying, can I get that 20-pound bag of macaroni slop that'll sit on the shelf for 5 years for cheap? Yeah, you can. So we've got these beautiful kitchens in these schools that aren't even being used because they're no longer producing real meals for kids. So I think that's a really important issue as well. We have to continue to support SNAP. We have to break chains. We have to do things like make sure that mom and dad are making a living wage. That's critical for making sure kids are getting food. It's a bottom line. This is not abstract. This is real. If your parents don't have enough money to buy quality food, they're going to buy cheap junk food because it's cheap, right? And they can love you and want you to have the most beautiful broccoli or organically grown broccoli in the world. But if they can't afford them, they can feed you for 2 meals for the price of that stalk of broccoli. It's a problem. We have to start looking at how things overlap. And one of those is a living wage and dignity with whatever job that you are doing to serve our communities.
Do you support a Green New Deal? Many voters in Tennessee, especially conservatives, but even like some moderate Democrats, they're focused on business initiatives and look at, there's a stigma that comes with like environmental policy, you know, right or wrong, it's a roadblock to development, things they see in, you know, certain news outlets. How do you sell things like clean energy and environmental regulations to voters like this?
Well, I think this is a really great question. I'll tell you why, because we're going to need money. We're going to need money to run the state. We don't do income tax. People don't, and sales tax is already a problem. It's really high. And when you ask somebody who's making $16,000 an hour to pay the same tax as somebody who makes $350,000, there's a problem because they're paying the same taxes. So we have to start looking at ways that we're going to generate income. And one of those, I believe, is to bring renewable sources here. And I'll tell you why. It's connected to what we can attract in terms of industry. So big companies like Yahoo and Google and companies like we just saw, Facebook is moving into Gallatin this week. Big companies that are looking for satellite headquarters who want to be in the South, they want to provide a really great standard of living for their families, their employees. And one of the things that they look at is how much renewable energy do you have? And their standards are 20 to 40%. If you don't have 20 to 40% of renewable energy, they don't want to be here. So if we're going to attract industry, which is going to bring in jobs, which is going to help boost our budget and our economy, we're going to have people spending more. That's going to generate income from taxes. That's going to all come to help us to have more money for schools. But it's also going to help in terms of our environment. So I don't see it as a roadblock at all. I see it as a really important, significant part of an economic recovery is to start to look at this. I also think that one of the things we're going to need to do is create jobs. And one of the ways we can create jobs is through a Tennessee Conservation Corps. We've done it before. Not the first time this would have to happen. And we can create jobs for young people who can come in and start to help to rebuild and sustain things that we already have in place in our communities. There's this great organization. They come in, it's called Greenfields, and they come in and they work with, and I think that they're somehow associated already in the whole government loop. But they're coming in and they are working to help us to take spaces that are toxic potentially and be able to remove toxins and rebuild and convert areas into usable spaces. And that's just part of the whole Green New Deal. So I think sometimes if we don't use the words green and new and deal, that we're more successful at talking about the things we want to get done. Conservatives are all about it when they think they can make $1, right? We can make $1 and get money and get better, you know, they're down with that. You know, it's a way for them to make investments. It's a way for developers. I'm meeting with a developer who has 600 acres in our district, and he's meeting with companies to have them come and install solar fields. Now, we don't just have to do that in an abstract way. It doesn't have to just be in pastures. Why don't we start to look at our rooftops? We have got so much square footage in our district alone, in District 6, that we could probably make a huge dent in the amount of energy that we need to use that's manufactured compared to what we can bring in through solar. So we've got a lot of potential here that I think is being overlooked at the moment. And I don't see it as a negative at all.
Circling back to women's reproductive rights, that's a huge part of your platform. And you mentioned earlier that the majority of Tennesseans actually agree with a woman's right to choose, but we know that there are still those single issue voters out there who are very opposed. So how do you reach those voters and win them over, and especially women?
All right, this is a really important one. And I've been talking about this for over 20 years. The first time I talked about this was when I was a guest speaker at a NOW convention in Los Angeles a bit of time ago. It's been more than a minute. But here's the reality. There's two things we need to talk about. One is that pro-choice does not mean pro-abortion. Pro-choice means you have a choice. If you would like to terminate a pregnancy, you can. And if you would like to carry a pregnancy, you can. Nobody can force you to carry a pregnancy, and no one can force you to terminate a pregnancy. That's what pro-choice means. So if you are of the ilk that you believe that it would be inappropriate and out of alignment with your lifestyle, with your partner, with your family, with your spirituality, then you can make the choice to carry a pregnancy or to terminate a pregnancy. But that gives you those options. That's what we're protecting. We're protecting because you got to remember, if somebody can say you can't have abortion, they're forcing you to have a pregnancy, to carry a pregnancy to term. And so we need to recognize what choice indicates. How I personally feel about it, as whether would I do this or do that, is irrelevant. It's not about what I would choose, it's that I want you to have choice. That's a really important first step. I guess that's the bottom line, is that we want to make sure that people have the right to access choice. And we also want to make sure that those people who are able to serve them, in this case, when we talk about what this bill that just passed, where we're talking about doctors who have been put at risk because they're told that if they don't post a sign that says that you can reverse the morning after pill, or you can be charged $10,000. That's not science. I mean, they stopped the trials for that because women were hemorrhaging so badly. So this is not an effective or a realistic way to deal with this from a medical perspective. So we have got people in Nashville who are playing doctor that are completely incompetent, and they're imposing laws on physicians that are without any merit. I think that's really important for people to realize. But I do think that I want to emphasize that this is a personal choice issue, and that the law provides that we have that protection.
Switching more to an agricultural subject, you would like to see cannabis legalized in the state of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. I think surveys would show that most voters agree with you on this in the state. I think most people are in favor of something like this. The question is, how do you convince religious conservatives that appear to be the one voting bloc left that is vehemently against something like this being proposed? How do you convince them that there's so many other benefits to this, and it doesn't have to be, this real polarizing thing for them that they have such a hard time grasping?
Ask them if they've ever taken an aspirin or an Advil or an antibiotic, and then I say, do you feel more comfortable with things made in a bathtub than things God decided to grow on the planet? How do you feel about the fact that you've got a whole system in your body that's a cannabinoid system that can help relieve things like inflammation and pain? And you know what? It's not just humans. Dogs have it too. I mean, it's all the way up the chain. We've all got a system that cannabis serves. Well, why do you think that's there? Well, I personally believe God made that for us, just like he made mint to make our bellies better. I just think that there is a reasonable way to look at that. And if you are comfortable with talking about being able to take chemically made medications, then we can see that we have medications that we can take right out of the ground and that can serve us in so many ways. We see that in Tennessee right now, about 72% of people are pro legalization of cannabis. Just over 50% want that to be medicinal. What we have found in other states that have taken that and in a stepwise way have first made medicinal marijuana available, and then from that have seen that, wow, that growth is a whole lot of income. Maybe we want to take that and make that available to the whole population, because we can tax that and use that for real income at the state level. So there's a lot to be gained when we talk about, again, fiscal responsibility. We've got a lot of farmland. Once again, it's ecologically much more sound than livestock. And we've already got a bunch of farms set up that got permits, starting in 2014 to use for hemp. So we have equipment here that has already been used to harvest hemp, and farmers that are already set up to be able to grow. And so I think that once again, we can bring it back to economics. When you talk about the religious perspective, I think it's really healthy to talk about the way that we have, beautiful things that are given to us that are growing on the planet that serve us well in ways that sometimes chemical stuff doesn't, in terms of side effects. We don't see any real increase in crime related to cannabis like we do alcohol, for example. And by that I mean, yes, of course, people are arrested and imprisoned and end up in that cycle, but that's only because it's been made illegal. So one of the benefits to legalizing it economically as well is it gets people out of prisons and back into the economy and working and contributing and buying loaves of bread and gallons of milk and a dozen eggs and paying taxes there and providing for their families, so that they're, if they have children or they have a spouse at home, that they lose that income when they're in prison. So it's really great when we can get them out of incarceration, we can get them home, get them back in the economy. That helps the government, right? Because they are able to support and sustain their own families. So I think this is, to me, it's a no-brainer. And I really don't know what the argument could potentially be to make it where that it could outweigh the things that we just talked about.
So then from the police reform standpoint, I want to ask you, so I've got a friend, she works for the sheriff's department, and I'm pretty sure she's pretty progressive in her political leanings. And, she made a comment once that I thought was really interesting from her experience in law enforcement. She said, when we talk about sending, say, like social workers and people like that who are trained in a specific field to an incident or an issue to help resolve it, where police officers might not have as much training there, and then you don't risk getting into this quickly inflating situation that leads to somebody getting hurt or killed when it shouldn't have happened that way. She said it's really a slippery slope, because she said sometimes these situations are super volatile and they can turn on a dime. And so if police aren't there in some capacity, it can really end up just as bad or even worse, because there's not somebody there to, help with a situation that got much worse. So I just thought that was an interesting take, and I'd be curious to hear, what do you say to that, as far as from a police reform standpoint, with the idea in mind that, hey, let's send other kinds of professionals out to scenes to try to remedy those situations and not necessarily send a police officer every time.
I think I would need an example. I think that, it's easy for us to talk in kind of generalities. I think I would need to hear an example of how something started as something that a social worker should show up for that ended up needing a police officer, because then we could talk about specifics, and that's something I'm much more comfortable addressing than sort of generalities that don't have anything, hooks that we can grab onto. But what I can say is that we have models that are already doing this, and we have them here in the United States. So in Eugene, Oregon, they've been doing this since the late 60s and early 70s. And they found that once they put together this group of community people serving the community who were trained to deal with things like people who don't have access to shelter, mental health issues, drug issues. These are people that, these are serious things. If you come upon somebody who's like tripping out on PCP, do you want somebody who's trained to deal with it in a manner that doesn't require a gun? Or do you want somebody who's trained to be there in a manner that requires a gun? So these people, it's not like we're just kind of going, well, we're going to go from, soda water to whiskey. That's not the idea. The idea is that the people that would be doing this work would be very much trained for that specific kind of intervention. And so I think that that's important for us to understand. It's not like you just go out in a big bus or a van and go, come on, jump in, hippies. That's not what it's about. It's about people having real training to be able to manage these situations. When we deinstitutionalized here in Tennessee, and of course it happened across the country with President Reagan, who deinstitutionalized our state hospitals that were serving a lot of these people, we found that there's a direct correlation. The data is there that shows that as those populations declined and those beds went away in those institutions, that there's an increase in the beds in our local jails and even in our prisons. That's not the place for people who don't have access to shelter. We see it downtown here in Knoxville, where people just get recycled in and out of the jails. They go in, everybody knows them by name. I have a business downtown. We have a monthly meeting. There's a police officer who comes in and he goes, well, so-and-so by name, and everybody knows who that person is. We go, oh, they're out again. Yeah, we took a group of people in and now they're free. So this is kind of a silly way to deal with a very real, tangible social problem.
All right, so hypothetically, you have won the election and you're heading to Nashville.
Yay.
You're in the legislature and you're surrounded by a bunch of old, religious, conservative white men who are all staring at you when you get your first opportunity to stand up and speak. Yes. And you advocate on behalf of LGBTQIA+ rights.
Yeah.
What specific policies are you advocating for? And what are you saying to make your case?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to look at these anti-discrimination laws. This just happened. This is relatively new, and it was specifically designed for the workplace. Oh, come on. These are human beings. Why is it the workplace and not your consumer rights to be able to go in and order a wedding cake? Why is that protected? What about if your physician says, I'm not going to see you because I'm not okay with your moral choice, and they're the ones who are saying moral? That's not up to us to even determine. Everyone that's in the state of Tennessee has a right to be able to walk in any restaurant and sit down and eat, has a right to be able to order a wedding cake. So I believe that that's one it's going to be challenging to try to dissuade them away from their built-in issues. But I think that we have to recognize that, once again, these are contributing members of our culture, and the more that we treat people within our cities and within our communities as if they don't belong, the more issues we create. And if we want to try to get rid of these issues, and we want people obviously to be participating in our economy, we want people to live here and be happy and healthy. We want our children who have lost homes and families for whatever reason to be able to find safe and loving places. That's a big one for me, because right now it is not legal in the state of Tennessee for a same-sex couple to adopt a child. And that is completely absurd to me. It even goes so far as to say, and this is a great one for those folks, people who have had trouble getting pregnant have had embryos frozen. And those embryos, are sperm and egg united and frozen and ready to roll in a uterus and become a human being at some point, hopefully, maybe. But the point is, we have those, and those families may have already had the children that they want, and they have those embryos, and they're willing to say, we would love for that embryo to find a home and be raised. We would love to give that to a family who needs that can't do it for whatever reason. And in the state of Tennessee, that's considered adoption. So you have couples, two women in this circumstance, because they have the uteri to be able to grow a pregnancy, but those women do not have access to that. So you believe in all your pro-choice, all your pro-life, and that those embryos should just sit there and they've got an option for a loving home. I think that's ridiculous. I can't even rectify that particular argument. I think that providing homes for any child in a loving home is a very powerful thing that we should be doing here in the state of Tennessee. So it really bothers me that that's going on.
All right, you survived our questions. This was the easy part.
Oh, here we go, yo.
Lisa.
Okay, you ready?
Okay, hang on. Let me put on my lipstick.
You gotta hurry, my phone's about to die.
Okay, well, at least I can look good if I fall flat on my face.
Okay. All right, there's a couple of rules.
Okay.
There's no crying, and you don't have access to an attorney.
Okay.
Can you handle that?
I think so. I don't know. It sounds a little like a setup.
Okay. And you got to answer the questions and the parameters that I give them. And if you get stuck on something, you can yell voter fraud.
Okay.
All right. Can you handle that?
I think so. How long is this
Okay,
going to
here
go
we
on?
Forever. Okay. You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Who's your spirit animal? Billy Porter or Cardi B?
Cardi B.
Mountains or beach?
Oh, good.
Come on,
Can I do
girl.
both?
Lord,
Can
no,
I do-
that was. You've already
Can
broken
I
the
do
rules.
mountains at the beach?
Okay. Holly Warlick or Bruce Pearl?
Holly Warlick.
Whitney Houston or Anna Nicole Smith?
Ooh, Whitney Houston.
World Health or World Bank?
World Health.
When you catch a buzz, are you singing or dancing?
Singing.
Okay. Work boots or work it?
Work it.
Okay. Roe v. Wade or Title IX?
Roe v. Wade.
Trick Daddy or Ludacris?
Trick Daddy.
Oh, yes! I'm so glad you said that. Okay. Soul Train or Brady Bunch?
Soul Train or what?
Brady Bunch.
Soul Train.
Okay, what's more important, trans awareness and acceptance of sexual fluidity, or prayer in school?
Trans awareness and sexual fluidity.
Okay, last time you shotgunned a beer?
I've never shotgunned a beer.
That's depressing. Okay, do you vote in favor of a candidate or against another candidate?
In favor of.
What's one issue that will change the world?
Oh, wow. I would say one issue. I think sustainable wage. I think sustainable wage. I think it's at the heart of so many problems. Yeah.
Okay, champagne or Cabernet?
Champagne.
Sunday brunch or girl time?
Girl time at Sunday brunch.
Flip-flops or a flop house?
Flip flops.
Okay, going big or staying true?
Staying true.
Favorite flavor of Gatorade?
I don't drink Gatorade. It's poison.
Oh. Recycle or reclaim?
Recycle.
Shots of Jaeger or shots of whiskey?
Oh, whiskey. I don't like Jaeger. Ugh.
Okay. Drunk texting or walk of shame?
Probably walk of shame.
Ah, I can handle that. Okay. Social justice or campaign donations?
Social justice.
RuPaul or Tyler Perry in life?
Who's the first one?
RuPaul?
Oh, or Tyler Perry?
Yeah.
Oh, well, oh boy. Well, I mean, they both do a lot of good. I think, wow. Oh, gosh. Well, one of the things I love about RuPaul is the fact that he has brought an awareness and a connection to a lot of people about, well, specifically people reclaiming or claiming themselves in a way that is changes the perception of who they are as individuals. And so although it's a category of people, we're talking about drag queens, what it does is it opens our doors and our eyes, especially for a lot of Americans who may not have ever met a drag queen, to the idea that people can be really different and see how real and human they are. And that's one of the beautiful things about his show. You get to see real humanity. You get to see people, you know, all the layers go away. And I think that that's a powerful thing. I also love the way he just empowers people in general, you know, his positivity and his encouragement, and the amount of fun he has in the world, right?
Okay. Pontoon boat or kayak?
Kayak.
2 a.m. at the club or a 6 a.m. paddle?
6 a.m. paddle.
Okay, cool. You survived.
So we always let a candidate have the last word, which that may have been your last word, and if so, that's great. But if you have anything else you want to squeeze in before we end, this is your chance.
I think it's really important right now that we try to pull ourselves together. I think that it's important that we start to look at ourselves as being on the same team with a couple of different playbooks, as I said earlier. I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity to listen to each other and talk to each other and not expect every conversation that we have about our state and where we're headed break down along some kind of party lines. I think we have a lot to gain by just saying, hi, I'm here. I want to hear what you have to say. What's your plan? When we were out on election day, that was one of the questions I kept saying to people. Talk to me. Tell me what you want. Tell me how you plan to get there. Tell me how that serves us, you know? And it was surprising to them that a Democrat would actually want to know that. And I'm sure because they're probably not too interested in knowing that about us and what our plan might be, but maybe that's the key and solution. You know, my grandfather was Republican, my grandmother was a Democrat, and they talked about stuff all the time. So I think it's important for us to start talking to each other. Let's stay away from names. Let's get away from the hate game. Let's stop even talking about who's voting for what for president. Let's just talk about what we need for Tennessee. And let's focus on making Tennessee the best place to be in 2021. I was a cheerleader.